A dog jumped in front of a car and saved a life. I never imagined that a single shrill bark on a still, moonless night could rip the world wide open. But that is exactly what happened. One desperate cry in the darkness, one flash of fur on the asphalt, one heart-stopping jolt of headlights piercing the gloom, and everything changed. I remember the exact moment vividly, not because I was there to witness it firsthand, but because the story reached me in shuddering echoes, like aftershocks from some distant, life-altering quake. Yet from the very first trembling retelling, I found myself riveted, trying to piece together how an ordinary dog, a humdrum sedan, and a fateful intersection of roads and choices could spin destiny on its head. It was nearing midnight on that winding country road, or so everyone said. Just a few hours before, the day had ended in the kind of sleepy hush that settles over small towns once the sun goes down. People had turned off their porch lights, locked their doors, and closed their blinds on the wide farmland sprawled beyond. Somewhere on the lonely highway slicing past fields of swaying wheat, there was a squeak of brakes, a screech of tires, and a scream, unintelligible but soaked in fear. And then came that bark, razor-sharp, maybe half a second before the sickening thud. It was the bark that saved a life, as sure as a miracle, but it cost something else in the process. At first, no one could figure out which life had been saved, or how. The immediate version of the story floating around the next morning was that a dog had come out of nowhere, thrown itself in front of a car, and thwarted a tragedy that would have claimed someone else's life. The gossip thrummed in the local diner, spilled from lips in hushed awe, traveled to grocery store clerks, and reached me like a chain of whispers. But each retelling left more questions than answers. Who was the driver? Whose dog was it? And most importantly, whose life had been spared by that strange and selfless act? My involvement began because I write for the small-town newspaper, if you can call a weekly 8-page pamphlet a newspaper, and stories like this spark wild fascination. I was tasked with tracking down the truth, unraveling the threads of rumor, and spinning them into something that made sense. Little did I know that the deeper I dug, the more I'd discover a tapestry of love, guilt, redemption, and the kind of heartbreak that binds us all. In that tapestry, an unassuming dog named Archie turned out to be both a catalyst and a guardian angel in fur. Through the days that followed, I learned every minute detail, clung to every emotion, and found myself overwhelmed by a surge of tenderness that left me both shaken and forever changed. The first real piece of evidence I uncovered came not from some official police report, but from a frantic young woman named. She had called me 2 days after the accident, her voice trembling over the line, saying she had urgent information to share. We arranged to meet at her house, a modest trailer pitched at the edge of a wind-blown orchard, where peach trees stood naked after a long winter. My breath swirled in the frosty air as I knocked on her door just before noon. She took a while to answer, and when she finally did, her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen. She wasted no time inviting me in. The living room was cramped but tidy, with a threadbare floral couch and mismatched rugs. From the corner, a timid dog with patchy brown fur peeked out, tail thumping once in curious greeting. Squeezed her hands together, nails bitten to the quick. Then, in halting, breathless words, she told me a story that set the stage for everything that followed. Had been on the phone with her older brother, Milo, late that night. He was crying and wouldn't say why. All she managed to glean was that he felt hopeless, stuck in an endless cycle of self-blame over something that had happened years ago in the city. He had lost a close friend, maybe to an overdose or a car accident, she wasn't certain. But the guilt was consuming him. He kept saying, "I'm so sorry," over and over again as if he were speaking to someone else. Then the line had gone dead, and, sensing something was terribly wrong, jumped into her pickup and went searching. She had a hunch he might be on that lonely stretch of road near their childhood home, because that was where he had often gone when he needed to be alone with his thoughts. When she got there, She found his car parked by the side with the hazard lights on, but he was nowhere in sight. She stepped out onto the cracked asphalt, her flashlight shaking in her hand, calling his name. The only answer she got was the wind rushing through the wheat fields, the rustle of dried stalks rattling like hollow bones. After nearly half an hour of wandering up and down the ditch, hollering for Milo, she stumbled upon footprints leading away from the road and into the field. She tried following them, but it was too dark and the ground too damp from an earlier drizzle. The footprints vanished amidst the tangles of broken weeds, and her fear ballooned. Desperate, got back in her truck, intending to search the other side of the highway. That was when her headlights caught a flicker of movement, the shape of a dog bounding across the road, and the silhouette of her brother just behind it. Before she could process what she was seeing, there was the sudden glare of another car's headlights cresting the hill, and a single, high-pitched bark sliced through the air. Everything seemed to happen at once. Milo staggered forward, unaware that he had wandered into the oncoming car's path. The dog lunged, a blur of brown yanking Milo's sleeve. The car's tires screamed as the driver slammed on the brakes. The dog barked once more, then collided with the grill, a horrifying crack echoing in the night. Milo was shoved backward out of the car's lethal path, while the dog tumbled like a rag doll, sliding across the road with a pitiful whimper. His voice shook as she relived the scene in front of me. She described how she sprinted toward her brother, screaming his name. He was unhurt physically, just utterly stunned. Meanwhile, the driver, an older man with wire-rimmed glasses, nearly fell out of his sedan in his haste to check on everyone. When they saw the dog lying motionless on the pavement, something inside them broke. Ran to the dog, placed a hand against its trembling flank, felt its labored breaths. It was alive, but the brokenness of its body was obvious. Blood slicked its fur, and a deep gash on its shoulder glistened in the headlights. She looked up at Milo, who was sobbing, arms wrapped around himself as if trying to hold his body together. The old man called an emergency number, voice cracking with panic. That was where story ended for the moment. She concluded by telling me how the dog was rushed to a small veterinary clinic in town, how it spent hours in surgery, how no one knew if it would pull through. They had taken to calling it Archie, because that name had been on a worn collar the dog was wearing, a faded blue strap with a half-rusted tag that read Archie on one side and a phone number on the other. The phone number led nowhere. It had likely changed owners long ago. When his voice gave out, she offered me a printed snapshot of Archie, taken in the clinic, lying prone on a hospital bed with bandages mummifying its front legs, muzzle pressed into a blanket. Though in pain, the dog's eyes glowed with a hint of life, a spark that refused to be snuffed out. I felt a lump in my throat. For some reason, I could see, in that dog's stare, a fierce devotion that transcended words or reason. Here was a creature that had intervened in the darkest moment of human despair. The next question was, why? The more I dug, the more I learned that Archie wasn't some random stray. He had a history in the area. Pieces of that history emerged as I pored over scattered testimonies. He had once belonged to a family living in a red-shingled house not far from the highway. Tragedy had forced them to relocate. The father lost his job, the mother fell ill, and the children scattered to relatives in the city. Archie, left behind in the shuffle, had slipped through the cracks. For months, neighbors would see him wandering the same familiar roads, waiting for a truck or a car that never returned. Some people had tried to coax him inside, but Archie seemed to resist captivity. He had grown half-wild, yet was never aggressive, just sorrowful, as if part of him still believed his family would come back. I discovered that detail by talking to Nancy, a gray-haired widow who lived closest to Archie's old home. She recalled seeing the dog perched on the front step day after day, waiting. Eventually, the house was sold to a new family and Archie was chased away. Nancy said it was heartbreaking. Every once in a while, she'd catch glimpses of him sniffing around, searching for scraps in trash bins, scuttling around behind barns. She once tried to feed him, but Archie only ate a few bites before darting off. He was loyal, she told me, her voice trembling, as if he didn't think he had the right to settle anywhere else. Through Nancy, I learned that Archie had a habit of being in the right place at the right time. About 6 months before saving Milo, the dog had been spotted trailing a lost child who had wandered from a playground. When neighbors found the child near a ditch, there was Archie beside her, watchful, as if making sure she didn't come to harm. Another time, a runaway cat was cornered by a coyote, and apparently Archie's appearance and low, warning growl kept the coyote at bay until the cat escaped. Though no one was entirely sure how accurate these stories were, the local lore surrounding Archie painted a picture of a gentle, protective spirit that roamed the outskirts of town, appearing whenever trouble lurked. No one, however, could have expected that dog to one day leap in front of a speeding sedan and prevent something far worse. The next time I saw, she looked more at peace. Milo, she said, was still struggling emotionally but had agreed to speak with me, partly as a way of confronting the wave of guilt that now haunted him. When I met Milo, he was a wiry young man in his late 20s, with dark hair that hung in his eyes. He wore a hooded sweatshirt and kept his arms crossed, as if bracing himself from a cold that might not have existed. Nervous tension radiated off him as he recounted his side of the story. He had parked on that dark road with no intention of driving home. Life, he explained in halting whispers, had become too difficult. He was carrying decades of unresolved grief, regrets about things undone, and the fresh memory of a friend's death. He felt certain the world would be better off without him. Stepping onto the asphalt in the middle of the night had been an unconscious cry for help, except he didn't want help. He was, by his own admission, lost in a haze of despair. What he did not expect was a sudden jolt of wet fur brushing against his leg, or the sound of sharp barking that yanked him out of his trance. He remembered turning his head and seeing Archie's eyes shining like twin beacons in the moonlight. A split second later, he became aware of headlights bearing down on them. He froze. Panic locked his limbs in place. Archie moved faster. The dog tugged the sleeve of his jacket with surprising force, as if physically pulling him backward. Milo stumbled out of the path of the car just as Archie took the brunt of the impact. It was so surreal and horrifying that Milo's mind went blank. He didn't even register the hot tears on his face until was there, touching his shoulders, telling him everything would be okay. His voice trailed off, and for a long moment we sat in silence. Finally, Milo looked up, tears brimming. "If it weren't for that dog," he said, "I wouldn't be here. It did what I was too weak to do. It stepped up to protect a life, even if that life was mine." The raw ache in his words pressed my own heart to a raw edge. In that moment, I understood that this was not just a story of a heroic dog. It was also a story of a second chance for a man who had lost faith in himself. But a question still gnawed at me. What had happened to Archie after the accident? Was he alive, stable? Did anyone claim him? Told me the dog was recovering at the veterinary clinic. She offered to take me there to meet Archie face to face. The trip was a winding blur of farmland and open sky as we made our way to the modest clinic, a squat building with chipped paint and a faded sign out front. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The air smelled of antiseptic and anxious animals. We found the veterinarian doctor bustling between exam rooms. At the mention of Archie, her face softened. She led us to a small recovery ward. Through a glass window, I saw rows of kennels, each holding an animal in various states of healing. Then we stopped at one near the end. There was Archie, lying on soft blankets, his front legs wrapped in fresh bandages, his sides stitched up. An IV tube and an oxygen monitor kept track of his vitals. At the sound of footsteps, Archie lifted his head with visible effort, tail scraping feebly on the kennel floor. My chest tightened at the sight. One of his eyes was partly swollen, his muzzle bruised. Yet even in that battered state, there was something gentle and comforting in his gaze. His ears twitched, and for a split second I thought I saw recognition in those bright brown eyes. Doctor explained that Archie had several fractures, one in his shoulder, one in his leg, and internal bruising. Infection was also a concern, but the staff was doing everything they could. At present, Archie was stable but far from out of danger. Surgeries would be expensive, and the clinic was running on limited resources. Piped up that she and Milo had started a small fundraiser in town and online. People were responding because word had spread quickly about the miracle dog. But there was still a lot of money to gather for long-term care and the possibility of specialized surgery out of town. I slipped my hand through the bars of the kennel, letting Archie sniff my fingers. His nose was cool and dry. He gave my fingertips a tentative lick, and I felt tears threaten to spill. In that unspoken moment, I was gripped by the enormity of what love and loyalty can cost. Here was a dog who had nothing, who had been cast aside by fate, yet still found the strength to protect a human in peril. Though battered and bruised, he was still forging forward, trusting the very species that had, in so many ways, abandoned him. At that point, I resolved to share Archie's story as widely as I could. Not just in our little paper, but to everyone who might read or hear it. This dog deserves a future, and if the cost of that future was a mountain of medical bills, it was time the community around him. That same afternoon, I wrote the first draft of a piece I would publish online and in print. I poured all the emotion I'd gathered into the words, every raw detail of Milo's despair, his frantic search, the chilling screech of brakes, and Archie's heroic leap. I ended the article with a plea for donations, linking directly to the fundraiser. It went viral in a way few small-town stories do. People from other countries, even from different states, reached out with donations, words of encouragement, and messages of awe. One anonymous donor contributed a sizable amount that covered half the surgery costs. Within a week, we had enough funds for Doctor to schedule Archie's next procedure, an operation to mend the fracture in his shoulder. On the morning of that surgery, I found myself pacing the clinic's waiting room with Milo. We barely spoke, tension thick like heavy fog. The surgery stretched on for hours. Finally, Doctor emerged, exhaustion etched in the lines on her face, but with a faint smile. Archie had pulled through. For the next few days, Archie's condition improved with each sunrise. He began to wag his tail more, started accepting food, and even managed to stand for a few seconds. Local families brought homemade blankets and squeaky toys to the clinic, wanting the dog to have something comforting. It was beautiful, witnessing that outpouring of kindness. Yet amid all this goodwill, there remained an unanswered question. Who would take Archie home once he was fully recovered? The clinic staff was already overburdened, and the shelter had limited space. A permanent home was needed, but it wasn't clear who was up to the task. And Milo expressed interest in taking Archie in, but they lived in cramped quarters, had limited funds, and Milo was not sure if he was emotionally stable enough for the responsibility. He wrestled with the notion that Archie had almost died saving his life. The guilt weighed heavily. He felt compelled to atone by caring for the dog, but was uncertain if he could handle it. In his darker moments, he worried that Archie might sense the negativity that sometimes consumed him. While that decision loomed, Archie's story kept traveling. People came to the clinic to meet him, some out of curiosity, others with genuine intentions of adopting. Archie, however, seemed to show the strongest connection to Milo. When they visited, his ears would perk up, and he'd strain to get closer, tail thudding with excitement. With strangers, he was cordial but distant. One evening, while Archie was still convalescing, something strange happened. The old man who had been driving the sedan that night paid a visit. His name was Harold Watson, a retired teacher. His conscience had been gnawing at him since the accident, though he was in no way at fault. Milo had stepped into the road unexpectedly, and Archie had caused the collision. Yet Harold couldn't shake the image of that dog rolling across the asphalt, the moment of sickening impact. He held himself responsible for Archie's injuries. With trembling hands, he placed a donation check in Doctor's hands, large enough to cover nearly all of Archie's future medication. But he offered more than money. He said he'd like to adopt Archie as soon as the dog was cleared to leave. It was the least he could do. This complicated things, and Milo had been leaning more and more toward bringing Archie into their home, though they had not fully decided. Now, with Mr. Watson stepping forward, the question of Archie's future had two paths. On one side, a stable, older gentleman with resources and a large house, wanting to stone and care for the dog. On the other, the siblings who felt a deep, almost spiritual bond with Archie but faced limited space and finances, as well as Milo's ongoing struggle with depression and guilt. Archie's fate hung in the balance. Time, however, forced a decision sooner than expected. About 3 weeks after the accident, Archie took a sudden downturn. An internal infection flared up unexpectedly, perhaps related to bruising in his lungs that went undetected. Doctor told us he was at high risk. If the infection spread, it could damage vital organs. An immediate and risky procedure was needed to remove pockets of fluid around his lungs, along with aggressive antibiotic treatment. Panic swept through all of us who had grown attached to Archie. Another fundraiser was quickly arranged. Donations poured in again, but what we needed most was a miracle. I remember sitting in the waiting room that night, feeling as though the entire world had narrowed to a single point, a lonely dog fighting for life behind closed doors. All the while, the wind howled outside, rattling the clinic's windows, like it too was anxious about Archie's fate. It was the small hours of the morning when Doctor emerged from the surgery. She was haggard, her brow glistening with sweat, but the corners of her mouth turned upward. Archie had survived again, just barely, but he was still breathing. Relief washed over us. Tears coursed down my cheeks, and I caught a glimpse of pressing her face against Milo's chest, sobbing with joy and exhaustion. Yet the heartbreak wasn't entirely over. Archie's immune system had been taxed severely. It would be a long, precarious road. Over the next several days, he drifted in and out of stable condition. Doctor, with the help of a specialist, managed to keep the infection at bay. Slowly, Archie regained his strength. Every day I visited, I saw progress. First in how he'd lift his head when I arrived, then in the way he'd try to stand when Milo came in, finally in the hint of an excited bark when coaxed him with treats. All this time, Mr. Watson remained a quiet presence, stopping by in the afternoons to inquire about Archie's progress, reading him short stories from a small notebook. He seemed sincere, though sadness shadowed his eyes. He confessed to me once that he hadn't always been there for his own family. His wife had passed. His children lived too far away for frequent visits. "I suppose," he said softly, "I'm trying to do right by someone who needs me." The day of Archie's final release from the clinic arrived sooner than we dared hope. It was decided that he would remain under medical supervision at home, taking antibiotics, but he no longer needed constant observation. The question of who would adopt him had to be answered. Doctor had made it clear. Archie needed a home environment that was low stress, with enough room for him to move around safely while he continued to recover. Milo, by then, had opened up to me about how Archie's intervention had shifted his outlook on life. He was getting therapy, had started medication, and was determined to build a stable future. As an act of gratitude, he was prepared to offer Archie a home, along with who had been supportive every step of the way. But Milo worried he didn't meet Doctor's criteria. Their trailer was cramped. He was still healing emotionally. There was also the matter of Mr. Watson's readiness and resources. In the midst of these debates, something unusual happened. Archie, who was typically subdued around Mr. Watson, began to show signs of restlessness when the older man visited. One day, Mr. Watson arrived with a collar and leash, hoping to gently introduce Archie to them. But Archie whined and turned away, tail between his legs. Sensing Archie's distress, Mr. Watson backed off. Later, when Milo stepped into the room, Archie immediately perked up, tail wagging. Mr. Watson noticed it too. He took me aside, his voice low and trembling. "I've been thinking, I might not be the best fit for Archie. He looks at me and I see fear or mistrust. Maybe it's because I was behind the wheel that night. Even though it wasn't my fault, I think he remembers. He needs to be with the people he loves, those who make him feel safe." I placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. He offered me a weak smile, tears glistening at the edges of his eyes. "I just want him to have the happiest life possible," he whispered. "Somewhere he's truly loved." That same afternoon, Mr. Watson let Milo know he would cover any remaining medical costs if they'd take Archie in. The relief I saw on Milo's face was indescribable. He nodded, voice shaking, and thanked Mr. Watson. Two wrapped her arms around the old man. With that arrangement in place, Archie was discharged into the siblings' care. They borrowed a large crate for nighttime, set up a cozy corner in their modest living room, and filled it with blankets, plush toys, and a water bowl. Archie arrived bandaged, still healing, but exuberant to be free from the confines of the clinic. When he sniffed around his new domain, tail swishing, I saw in him the beginnings of hope and peace. From that moment on, the dog who had saved a life was about to start a new chapter of his own. Though his story might have ended there, fate had more twists in store. Milo, encouraged by Archie's companionship, found a renewed purpose. He started volunteering at a local animal rescue organization, helping to walk and socialize dogs. It was a way of paying forward the gift Archie had given him. Slowly, the black cloud that had trailed Milo for years began to lift. He still had tough days, moments of darkness, but the difference was that he no longer walked that road alone. Meanwhile, Archie's reputation grew. People would stop by to meet him, to drop off treats or ask for updates. It turned out that his presence was having a ripple effect. A lonely neighbor down the street, who rarely left her house, began stepping outside more often to see Archie sniffing around the yard. A shy teenager who'd never volunteered for anything took an interest in helping out at the animal rescue, inspired by Milo's story. The dog's quiet courage had ignited sparks of kindness all around. Archie, for his part, proved to be an anchor for Milo, and on days when Milo's anxiety flared, Archie would sense it, resting his head on Milo's lap until the tremors subsided. On nights when insomnia returned, traces of trauma from her own childhood, Archie would curl up by her bed, eyes softly watchful, as if guarding her from nightmares. It was as though Archie sensed the wounds in both siblings and decided to become a gentle balm, a living testament to the power of unconditional love. Several months passed in a gentle rhythm of healing and growth. Milo got a part-time job at a local hardware store, managed to pick up extra hours cleaning vacation cabins on the lake nearby. Their finances improved enough to rent a slightly larger place, one with a small fenced yard so Archie could roam safely. Archie's bandages came off, replaced by a permanent limp in one leg, but otherwise he bounded around happily. When neighbors witnessed him galloping awkwardly but joyfully across the yard, chasing a chew toy, they couldn't help but smile. Something about Archie's resilience brought hope. Through it all, I kept documenting their journey for the newspaper. Each update garnered heartfelt reactions from readers, local and distant. Donations continued to trickle in to help with Archie's ongoing therapy sessions. The entire community seemed united in wanting a happy ending for the dog that had once roamed the roads alone. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it. One humid summer night, a vicious thunderstorm descended upon our town. Lightning slashed across the sky, thunder boomed like artillery, and the wind howled ferociously. Trees bent under the onslaught and some were uprooted. Power lines snapped, plunging entire neighborhoods into darkness. And Milo's new rental house was not spared. The wind tore down part of the fence and rainwater flooded the yard. As the storm raged, Archie, who had always been uneasy about loud noises, whimpered in terror. He paced by the door, refusing to settle. Milo tried to calm him, holding him close, but each crash of thunder made Archie tremble. At one particularly deafening clap, Archie bolted, slipping from Milo's grasp, claws scraping against the linoleum. He lunged at the back door. In a panic, Milo opened it to see what was happening outside, forgetting for a moment that the fence was down. Archie took the chance to dash out into the storm. With a cry of alarm, Milo followed, barefoot, into the swirling chaos of wind and rain. What followed was a frantic chase through waterlogged streets and howling gusts. Archie, overwhelmed by fear, sprinted blindly. Milo slipped, scraping his knee on asphalt, but he pushed himself up and kept going, calling Archie's name into the roaring darkness. Flashes of lightning illuminated the silhouette of the dog in the distance, skidding on slick roads. Cars were parked or absent. No one dared drive in such a storm. Hearing the commotion, grabbed a flashlight and joined the search. Neighbors saw the lights bobbing in the downpour and came out to help. It was a harrowing scene. A handful of drenched figures stumbling around in the raging weather, calling for Archie, the wind yanking the words out of their mouths and flinging them into emptiness. Hours passed, or so it felt, though it might have been mere minutes. Eventually, and Milo stood panting on a street corner, water dripping from their hair, their hearts throbbing with fear. Then, in a brilliant flash of lightning, glimpsed a shape huddled under a half-collapsed porch. She rushed forward with the flashlight. It was Archie, trembling and soaked, his eyes wide with terror. He had found partial shelter, but water was still pouring onto his fur. Milo knelt and extended a hand, voice trembling with relief. "Archie," he whispered, "come here, boy. It's okay. I'm here." Archie's ears perked at Milo's familiar voice. Slowly, carefully, he crept forward and pressed his wet muzzle against Milo's palm. In that moment, thunder rumbled overhead, but Archie didn't flinch. He only had eyes for the man he had once saved. Milo scooped Archie up, despite the dog's weight, and carried him back through the swirling rain, tears of relief mixing with the storm water on his face. That storm and the near loss of Archie drove home just how tightly the siblings had come to rely on him, and how deeply Archie relied on them in return. It was an emotional turning point. No longer was Archie just a dog who had saved Milo's life. He was family, woven into their everyday existence, providing comfort and stability in a world that could still be frightening. In the aftermath of the storm, the community once again. Neighbors helped repair Milo and fence. Mr. Watson came by with homemade soup and a new bed for Archie, to replace the one that had been soaked and ruined. Doctor checked Archie's health. Aside from a few scratches, he was fine. "He must have 9 lives," she quipped. "No storm can bring him down." Time flowed on, carrying with it the last traces of that dramatic night. Archie's limp had improved thanks to ongoing therapy. He now moved with a jaunty grace. Milo continued therapy for his mental health, and although he still wrestled with doubt on difficult days, Archie's unwavering presence had changed his perspective on life. Two found a quiet peace in her routine. The scars of her past, though not entirely vanished, seemed more bearable with Archie curled at her feet at night. Their household might have been modest and filled with second-hand furniture, but it radiated a rare warmth born of gratitude. Months turned into a year. My article updates became less frequent as Archie's story settled into local legend. People would still wave to him when they passed by. Some would say, "There goes Archie, the wonder dog," with a smile. Life was simple, steady. Then, as if the universe had decided the story needed one final, heart-stopping note, tragedy loomed again. One crisp autumn evening, a fire broke out in a neighboring property where a family of 5 lived. It started in the garage, a faulty wire in a rusted extension cord. By the time the smoke alarms blared, flames had already spread to the kitchen. The parents rushed to get the children out, but in the chaos, their youngest, a toddler, got separated. Panicked, they searched the house, but thick smoke blinded them. They scrambled outside, screaming for help, fear clawing at their throats as the fire flared. and Milo were among the first to see the flickering orange glow painting the night sky. They grabbed a fire extinguisher and sprinted to the scene. Archie followed on instinct, tail high, ears alert. By the time they arrived, the parents were frantic, yelling that their baby was still inside. Neighbors tried to quell the flames with garden hoses, but it was useless. The heat was overwhelming, black smoke pouring from every window. Milo was about to charge in when Archie suddenly darted past him, under the swirling smoke. It happened so quickly that no one could react. One moment, Archie was by Milo's side, the next he was gone, plunging into the house's open doorway, swallowed by the roaring inferno. Screamed after him. Milo dropped the extinguisher, heart pounding so hard he thought his chest would explode. He tried to run in after Archie, but neighbors pulled him back, yelling about the danger. Inside the house, acrid smoke rolled in waves, sparks raining from the ceiling. Time felt suspended, as if the entire world had paused to hold its breath. Then, through the rolling smoke, a high-pitched wail pierced the chaos, a child's cry. Moments later, Archie emerged, stumbling, his fur singed, coughing from the swirling fumes. In his gentle jaws, he gripped the hem of a tiny nightgown, tugging along a tear-streaked toddler who was crawling and sobbing. Archie guided the child forward, half dragging, half nudging, until neighbors rushed in and scooped the toddler into their arms. A thunderous roar signaled that part of the ceiling collapsed behind them, sending flames spiraling. People scrambled for safety. Milo and Tear, streaming, gathered Archie into their arms. The dog's chest heaved with ragged breaths, his eyes reddened from the smoke. But he was alive, and so was the child he had rescued. Sirens wailed down the block. Firefighters and paramedics converged, battling the blaze and tending to the injured. Archie was whisked away to doctor's clinic again, suffering from smoke inhalation and minor burns. That night, I found myself standing outside the clinic's back door, trembling, waiting for news. It was a stark reminder of the night I had first learned of Archie's accident. But this time, the entire community seemed to hold vigil alongside me. Word had spread instantly that Archie, the wonder dog, had saved another life. It was as though the entire town had pressed pause to see if our furry hero would survive this new danger. Exhausted, Doctor emerged around sunrise. Her expression was weary but cautiously optimistic. Archie was on oxygen, had burned paws, and his lungs needed careful monitoring, but he would likely pull through. Everyone who heard the news let out a collective sigh of relief. Another miracle, another testament to Archie's unbreakable spirit. For the next few days, Archie lay recuperating in a special enclosure at the clinic, reminiscent of the time he spent there after the car accident. But this time, his eyes seemed wiser, more resolute. He accepted fussing from the staff, the gentle pats from visitors, as though he knew he had done his duty. When Milo finally took him home, the entire town cheered, literally. People stepped out of their houses, clapped and whistled as Milo carried Archie in his arms, tears of gratitude on his face. It was a spontaneous show of love for the dog that had now saved 2 lives in the face of certain death. In the aftermath of that fiery night, no words seemed adequate to describe the surge of pride and love the community felt for Archie. The local paper, my paper, ran a front-page story with the headline, "A Dog Who Jumps into Danger and Saves Lives." Even bigger media outlets picked it up. Offers flooded in, from advanced training programs for rescue dogs, from families wanting to adopt Archie. But by then, everyone understood Archie's home was with and Milo. No one dared separate them. They were inseparable, bound by the kind of bond that only extraordinary circumstances can forge. As Archie healed, I visited often, bringing him treats. I asked Milo once, in a quieter moment, how he felt about the chain of events that had begun with Archie throwing himself in front of a car to save Milo's life. Milo's gaze drifted to the dog napping contentedly on the floor, his bandaged paws tucked close. "He showed me what it means to live," Milo said simply. "I tried to give up on life, and he risked his own to show me that it was worth fighting for. That's what Archie does. He stands between people and darkness, even when it nearly destroys him. Sitting there, I realized the profoundness in those words. Archie's story wasn't just about heroics. It was about the triumph of compassion over despair, of love over loneliness, of second chances over final endings. Yes, a dog jumped in front of a car and saved a life. But that was merely the prologue to a tale of enduring devotion, redemption, and grace. Eventually, the town decided to honor Archie with an official ceremony, an event on a sunny Saturday afternoon at the refurbished local park. Families arrived with homemade posters celebrating Archie, children wearing dog-ear headbands giggling excitedly. A local singer performed a gentle ballad, tears glistening at the mention of Archie's heroic acts. Milo, shy as ever, stood on a makeshift stage with at his side, Archie sitting between them. A hush fell as the mayor, an elderly woman with a warm smile, pinned a small medal onto Archie's collar and declared him an honorary rescue dog. Camera shutters clicked, applause thundered. Archie, perhaps a little overwhelmed by the attention, wagged his tail. His eyes scanned the crowd, but his gaze returned to Milo and every time. And there, in that moment of celebration, I saw not just a dog or two siblings, but a symbol of hope and resilience that had touched everyone in that park. Archie had bridged gaps between neighbors, reminded us of what truly mattered, and proved that from the rubble of tragedy, love can emerge, unstoppable and bright. Over the following weeks, the story of Archie spread anew online, drawing comments from people far and wide. Some had been on the brink of despair themselves, and said Archie's bravery reignited their will to keep living. Others were simply moved to tears, thanking the universe for dogs like Archie who remind humanity of our best qualities. Donations poured into animal shelters in the region, spurring an increase in rescue and adoption efforts. The spark Archie ignited refused to dim. Life settled into a gentler routine once again. The toddler Archie had rescued recovered fully from smoke inhalation, and Milo continued volunteering with the animal rescue. Began studying at a local community college, hoping to become a vet technician. She had discovered a newfound passion while tending to Archie's injuries. Mr. Watson occasionally dropped by with groceries or small gifts, content in seeing Archie well cared for. Doctor, grateful for the renewed community interest in animal welfare, expanded her clinic with updated equipment. And Archie, he grew older, a bit slower, but his spirit shone as brightly as ever. He loved long naps in a patch of sunlight by the window, an occasional adventurous romp around the yard, and quiet evenings pressed close to Milo's leg as the siblings watched television. Sometimes the old limp in his shoulder flared up on cold mornings and would rub a warm compress against it. Other times, Milo would wake from a nightmare and Archie would be there, muzzle on Milo's chest, as steady and comforting as a heartbeat. There was a hush in the final months of that year, a warmth in the crisp air as autumn rolled into winter. Snow dusted the streets, turning them into a reflective white canvas. Archie, still uncertain about cold weather, gingerly stepped onto the powdery ground, sniffing curiously, then scampered back indoors. Milo laughed, snapping a picture to share with the local paper's social media page. Small joys like this had become the new normal. From the darkness of near tragedy, a tapestry of shared kindness had emerged. At times, I found myself sitting at my kitchen table, reflecting on the magnitude of everything Archie's life had touched. If that single moment on a deserted road had never happened, if Archie hadn't barked, hadn't leaped into the path of that sedan, where would Milo be? Likely lost to his own despair. And that child in the burning house? The question was too painful to consider. The more I pondered it, the more it felt as though Archie's presence on this earth was orchestrated by some loving force beyond our understanding. Some might scoff at calling it destiny, but in my heart I believe it. As the winter stretched on, I collected the final details for a long feature piece I planned to publish, an in-depth chronicle of Archie's life, from his humble beginnings as an abandoned family dog to the hero he became. I wanted to capture everything. The quiet heartbreak of waiting for a family that never returned, the leaps of faith that saved Milo and the toddler, the unwavering resilience in the face of repeated injuries. I wanted readers to feel Archie's story in their bones, to understand that hope can indeed come from the most unexpected places. On a clear morning in early spring, I stopped by Milo and's home to conduct what I expected to be my final interview for the piece. The sun was bright, the scent of thawing earth lingering in the air. When I knocked, Archie barked from inside, followed by the scuffle of paws. Milo opened the door with a grin, stepping aside to let Archie greet me. I ran my fingers through the fur around Archie's neck, carefully avoiding the patch near his shoulder. He wagged his tail vigorously, a clear sign of welcome. We sat down, and Milo began recounting how much better his life had become. He was moving on from the guilt and depression that had once suffocated him. He was even considering returning to school part-time. Joined us, sharing how Archie's presence made her feel safe at night, how she no longer feared the silent hours before dawn. It was as if Archie's quiet, watchful love had coaxed them both back into the world of the living, a place where simple joys and acts of kindness formed the bedrock of hope. Halfway through our conversation, Archie wandered over to the screen door, gazing outside at the yard. There was a soft breeze ruffling his fur. He turned his head back, as though beckoning us to join him in the sunlight. Milo followed, opening the door so Archie could stroll into the yard. We trailed behind, and I watched as Archie sniffed a patch of new grass and then lifted his head to the sky, as if inhaling the season's promise. Birds sang overhead, their melodies weaving through the crisp air. Archie's eyes drifted shut for a moment. He looked content, perfectly at peace, and in that simple, luminous instant time seemed to slow. This dog, battered by life and adversity, exuded a serenity that felt almost sacred. No one spoke. We just existed in that moment with him, three humans and one extraordinary dog, all quietly acknowledging the immeasurable bond forged between us. A dog that, in a single selfless act, had averted tragedy and ushered so much good into the world. A dog that had shown us how love can bridge the cavernous gap between hopelessness and redemption. I later returned home and typed the final paragraphs of my long piece. I ended it with a reflection on that peaceful scene in the yard. In the end, Archie did far more than jump in front of a car to save Milo's life. He reminded us all of the possibility that lies in every moment, a capacity for compassion, for breaking the shackles of despair, and for choosing, time and again, to stand guard over each other's fragile existence. He showed us that sometimes, all it takes to tilt the balance from tragedy to hope is one bark in the dark, one act of wild courage, one unwavering heartbeat that refuses to give up. Archie's legacy will forever be the echo of that bark, reverberating through countless hearts, reminding us that every life, no matter how lost or lonely, can be redeemed by love. I pressed publish with a trembling hand, feeling the tide of emotion wash over me. The story went live, and within hours, readers were sharing it, commenting on Archie's heroism, on the resilience of Milo, and on the generosity of a small town that refused to let a miracle slip through its fingers. Their words came from every corner of the world, testimonies of renewed faith, confessions of sorrow turned to hope. It was everything I could have hoped for, and more. Looking back, it's clear that Archie's tale is not merely a story about a dog and a near-fatal car accident. It is a testament to how one life can ripple out in ways we can't predict, how a single act of courage can reshape destinies. His bark, piercing the stillness of that deserted highway, was more than a warning cry. It was a clarion call for all of us to open our eyes, to reach out, to care. And for that, for all he gave us, we remain forever humbled by the gift of one small dog's colossal heart. Today, when I walk the winding paths of our little town, I sometimes catch sight of Archie trotting alongside Milo, his limp an almost invisible reminder of the night everything changed. Children run up to pet him, giggling. Elderly neighbors wave and call out his name. Stands on the porch, a gentle smile on her lips, watching the sun paint gold on Archie's fur. And I smile, too, because I remember that once upon a time in the hush of midnight, a dog jumped in front of a car and saved a life. Then he went on saving lives, healing hearts, and reminding each of us that there is always a reason to keep going, even when hope seems lost in the blackness of the night. And in that knowledge, we find the courage to live, love, and share Archie's story. Because miracles do happen, and sometimes they come in the shape of a wounded dog with a wagging tail, sprinting into danger before any of us even realize we need to be saved. His bark lingers in the memory of everyone who's heard it, a promise that in the darkest hour a guardian may yet appear, leaping headlong into harm's way, breaking the chain of catastrophe so that life, glorious, unpredictable life, can triumph once again.